So you're trying to do a new thing and it's feeling a little uncomfortable. One of the things I hear the most with people that are taking on something new, trying to change the course of their life, is that it's really hard feeling again like a beginner. It's uncomfortable, it's stressful, it's overwhelming, it produces anxiety. Frankly, for most of us grown-ups, our nervous systems totally misfire when we're thrust into situations where we feel sort of like a hapless beginner all over again. And I want to speak to this because it's probably the single biggest limiting factor on the growth of most adults and most adults' ability to transform their quality of lives over time, right? So I want you to remember back, try to remember to the time in your life when being a beginner wasn't a thing. There was no self-consciousness around being a beginner. In what's called psychosocial stage theory, which is a psychological frame for viewing the development of a human life, there was a period of time in which we were learning to resolve what's called industry versus inferiority. It's when we essentially develop a view of self as either industrious and capable and able to go out and take on new things and create meaningful results, or inferior. And the psychosocial stage during which this happens generally runs around 6 to 11 years old. So it's kind of like pre-adolescence. So as you think back on your life and try to remember a time when you weren't self-conscious about being a beginner, or you didn't feel insecure, or you didn't get uncomfortable doing new things that you'd never done before, or feeling like you still had so much to learn and you were not yet competent at a thing, it's typically going to be in early to mid-childhood, like pre-adolescence. And so try to pinpoint, when did that flip? When did that change? When did we go from the kid that was excited to raise his or her hand in a class and ask the teacher a question that put our ignorance on plain display because we were just excited to get new knowledge and to build that sense of industry or industriousness by acquiring new knowledge, to a self-consciousness that if I raise my hand and I ask a question, I'm betraying my own ignorance and I'm putting on display for all to see the fact that I don't know and that somehow that's wrong. It's actually a ridiculous idea to think that I should know things which I have not yet learned, or I should have knowledge that I have not yet had the experience to acquire. The notion that we're supposed to go through life looking like we know what we're doing when we're doing things that we don't know how to do is totally preposterous, and yet all of us at some point between around 6 and 11 years old became that person that is now trying to spend the rest of their life pretending that they're not a beginner at virtually anything worth doing in life and any new experience worth having. So, try to consider that, maybe think about that, maybe like consider that frame for your life, and try to recontextualize your relationship to the entire adult world, that if you can get over your concern about the opinions of others, the best thing you could be doing in life is usually at some level being a beginner at something, because it means you have the most room to grow, the most opportunity to learn, and the most possible impact you can have on the trajectory of your life. This idea of it's uncomfortable to be a beginner and to be trying new things is such a trap. And it comes from, essentially the insecurity, the generalized insecurity and anxiety of being an adult human who thinks they've graduated from the stage of life that was about learning, and they're now into the stage of life that's about execution on the basis of what was previously learned to produce a result that we can show off to our peers, right? If we accept that the idea of being uncomfortable because we're a beginner, because we're learning something new, is somewhat ridiculous, then we can start to rethink that whole paradigm. And I would start with the simple question: what does the word comfort actually mean? By the way, as a general practice, I encourage you, look up the origin of words. It will change your entire conception of the world as you reprocess the language that you use to describe it, because so often words mean different than what we think they mean, or more than what we think they mean. So the word comfort comes from the original Latin confortare, later the French conforter, which basically means together we form strength, or within a place of strength, right? To go inside a place, essentially to go into our fort, comfort, to within our fort. We create strength together through being inside of a fort, right? Okay, cool, makes sense. If you're under attack, by all means, retreat to the fort and gather all your buddies and meet them there so that you can like rearm and, fight the fight that there is to fight. But that's not the life that we're having all the time. I agree, if you're under some form of extreme siege, then by all means retreat to the fort. But if you're not, really going to spend your whole life in the fort? sounds, I don't know, kind of boring, honestly. Venture forth, right? The point of life is not to stay in one place. If it was, we wouldn't be growing and changing every single day, right? So leave the dang fort as often as possible, because everything that could conceivably grow you or sustain you beyond the rations that you already have boxed inside of your fort with you exist outside the fort. When we feel uncomfortable because we're back to being a beginner or we're learning something new, my basic question is, according to whom? In the sense of who's looking at you, who's watching, who's judging, right? As adults, we become this being that's generally uncomfortable with the idea of looking unpracticed or unpolished or inexperienced or looking like we're a beginner. But first of all, most of the time we're doing something that we're a beginner at, there's nobody else around. So whose opinion are we actually worried about? It typically comes down to the opinion of self, which means we're allowing a really illogical and unhealthy projection that we place onto others on a belief that they're projecting it back to us, that we look silly in this optical mirroring process of being seen as being a beginner, but really it's us seeing ourselves through the lens through which we think others see us and project back to us that it's some sort of a failing to be a beginner. Like, even as I'm describing it, this just sounds like word salad. It's so ridiculous. Celebrate being a beginner. Be excited to be a beginner. Be excited to be in a place where you have more rapid progress available to you, because we all know that beginners progress more rapidly than veterans at anything. You have more new knowledge to acquire. You have more new experience to have. You have more new relationship with self to negotiate. You have all this stuff that's possible, that is only possible to the extent that you build into your life this consistent experience of being a beginner at things. When did we become so self-conscious that we cut off the legs of our own growth because we're trying to look, proficient all the time, and we're afraid to look like we're where we should want to be, which is learning and growing, i.e. being a beginner. So if you're feeling this discomfort that we typically associate with being a beginner, ask yourself, what neurological system, what part of my brain chemistry is feeling uncomfortable right now? Because we typically have three different systems. I say typically, it's actually deeper than that. It's everyone all the time has three different neurological reward and feedback systems running in their psychobiology, right? Their brain and body. First of all, we have sort of the baseline operating system, which is all oriented around dopamine and immediate gratification and survival and like fending off the tiger and like harvesting the crop and like nurturing the baby and like perpetuating life, right? It's like our default primordial operating system. That system is running all the time. And by the way, whenever we feel uncomfortable, it's typically that system is what we're experiencing. But we have two other systems. We have social reward systems, which sometimes produce discomfort. And this is more around like bonding and relationships and connection. There's, oxytocin is kind of like the primary neurotransmitter in this system. And this is why we care what other people think. And we try to be like integrated, functional, productive members of society so that we don't get, isolated and ostracized from the tribe and die alone in the jungle, right? Like there is a certain benefit to wanting to functionally integrate with other people and to some degree care what they think, although I don't love that language frame. But that's a whole different reward system, right? We have the social reward system. And then we have essentially the metaphysical reward system, which operates at the level of consciousness and operates at the level of creativity. And it's sort of the part of us that drives toward transcendence and meaning and depth and purpose and actualization and all this higher order stuff that, by the way, that's the only reward system. The metaphysical transcendent reward system is the only reward system that differentiates us from all other animals. All other animals have at least the kind of baseline survival-oriented dopaminergic system. At least most primates, and some even like reptiles and even insects have some basic social reward system that governs integration within, a fellowship of others, let's say. But only we were installed, like we came installed from the factory with imagination and creativity and like existential longing and philosophical questioning and musing on non-object oriented thought, tracks of thought that lead us to unpredictable, undiscovered, wondrous places. Like we were all installed with this software that is, I would argue, it's seems pretty logical that the thing that makes us different is probably the thing that makes us special, which is the thing that speaks to our calling and our purpose and our reason for being on this earth. I think that the purpose of being a human on this earth is to be less like a monkey and more like a human, which means asking, well, what's different between a monkey and a human? Because they're like 99.2% the same or whatever. Well, the difference is all the metaphysical rewards. It's all the higher order consciousness. It's all the things that we can do that they can't. And so when I'm feeling uncomfortable, it's usually coming from the same system that crustaceans operate from and tiny little insects operate from and like fish and the birds in the trees. Like they're all feeling uncomfortable all the time whenever like basic survival is threatened. But you know what the difference between us and birds are and us and bugs are and us and fish are is that we're generally not at risk of being squashed or shot or eaten by a larger predator in the food chain all the time. So why don't we take those higher order functions, that third level reward system that's built into us and no other species, and learn to live from that place? Or we can just say, well, I'm uncomfortable and therefore I'm going to give in to that part of me that is more like a lobster and let my discomfort stop me from being a beginner, stop me from trying new things, stop me from having experiences. I'm going to live my life as much like a lobster as possible and as little like a man. Makes no sense. Why would we live that way? Okay, so you're trying something new and you're feeling uncomfortable and you don't like the way it feels because, well, what does that even mean? We don't like it. It means we've attached some meaning to it. Like it's morally good or bad. That's probably a subject for another video, like trying to reframe or reprocess the meaning we attach to feelings. But let's just accept it as a given, right? I am doing something new and I feel uncomfortable. Okay, let's say, okay, well, if I'm feeling something new and it's making me feel uncomfortable, then the way to feel more comfortable would be to go to something at which I feel less new. I feel more expert at. I feel more experienced at, right? So what are the things that we're like the world's greatest experts at? Because according to the notion that like being a beginner equals discomfort, then being as far from a beginner as possible would be as far from discomfort as possible. So let's find our area of greatest expertise. What are those areas, right? The things that we are most expert at are the things that we have the most practice at, the things we have repeated the most, i.e. our habits. And yet our entire life is a product of our habits. So if we are inhabiting a life that we are not completely 100% satisfied with, that we know is a product of our habits, i.e. that with which we have the most expertise, then defaulting back to comfort, running away from the feeling of discomfort associated with being a beginner means running back to those things that we have habituated expertise at that are exactly the reason we have the life that we're currently saying we're dissatisfied with, and which is why we become a beginner at anything, is because we want something to change, right? So to accept a priori that discomfort equals trying to do anything about that which has resulted in your life from doing other things that were more comfortable, you will start to be excited about discomfort. You will start to lean into discomfort. You will start to celebrate and crave the feeling of discomfort because it means you're actually doing something about the results that you're dissatisfied with that are the result of doing the things with which you are more comfortable. So at the end of the day, our quality of life is ultimately determined by one thing, only one thing: our nervous system's capacity to tolerate new experiences. That is literally the ultimate constraint on our quality of life, is how able am I at a neurological level to tolerate new experiences? And so if you're a beginner at something and you're feeling discomfort, recognize this is data. All this is feedback. It's telling you that this is the point, this is the threshold at which your nervous system starts to fire differently in a way that you're not used to, because you're starting to experience something that is beyond the familiar. You're starting to have a new experience. And guess what? The only conceivable way to change anything meaningful about your life is to step past that threshold into the level of new experience, into the level at which your central nervous system starts to flash danger, danger, retreat, retreat, right? So over time, what is really the point of life? Is the point of life to accept it like a fixed hand of cards that we were dealt and there's no swapping out through the deck. There's not even like a game to play that results in a pool that we could win or lose. Like I'm not even supposed to play the game. I'm just supposed to sit here and stare at my cards and accept that the entirety of my life is determined by this hand that I was dealt and it's unchanging. I'm pretty sure we all agree that's not the point of life. But yet to try to go any iota beyond that is to activate our nervous system's resistance to change, right? And so ultimately over the course of a life, I would argue the point isn't to try to change our environment or change our circumstances or change our results or change our reality or ultimately change the life we had according to some different fixed vision of what it's supposed to look like relative to what it currently looks like. That all sounds futile because essentially you're banking on variables, at least some of which are going to be beyond your control. What is the one thing that we can always be controlling? It is stretching our nervous system's capacity to tolerate new experiences. And the only way to do that is to have new experiences, to push ourselves into new experiences. And just like everything else in life, it gets easier the more we do it, right? So if we change our frame of our life from this is how it's supposed to look, and I need to be doing whatever the things are that get me to this place that is how it's supposed to look. And in the meantime, I'm constantly shaming myself and beating myself up and judging myself based on the gap between how it currently looks and how I'm saying it's supposed to look. I think we can all accept that is giving away so much of our power and so much of our joy and so much of our ability to self-regulate and self-determine how we feel on a moment-to-moment basis. What if all we focus on is, am I consistently expanding the capacity of my nervous system to tolerate new experiences by consistently pushing myself to have new experiences? I would suggest that's probably going to be a lot more enjoyable and long-term a lot more effective to get to any place that you would actually like to go, regardless of how much it does or doesn't look like the place that you currently are.